What would you do if you walked into the most prestigious jewelry house in New York City, wearing your favorite thrift store cardigan and your comfortable teaching flats, and 3 saleswomen looked at you like you'd tracked mud across their marble floor? What would you do if you held out your engagement, a tarnished antique band with a stone so clouded by age it barely caught, and asked politely if they could clean it, only to have the senior saleswoman with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, examine it for 3 seconds, and say loudly enough for the entire showroom to hear, "We don't service costume jewelry. Try Claire's at the mall." What would you do if a woman in head-to-toe Chanel, dripping in diamonds that screamed new money, actually laughed out loud and said, "Oh my God, is that even real metal? It looks like something from a gumball machine." I'll tell you what, I stood very still in the showroom with its crystal chandelier and its cases full of gems worth more than houses, and I looked at them with their designer clothes, and I said, a small, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that in exactly 14 minutes, 3 armored vehicles were going to pull up outside, 8 royal guards in full ceremonial uniform were going to enter this building, the entire block was going to be cordoned off by diplomatic security, and these women were going to learn exactly what they'd been holding when they dismissed my costume with such casual, but I'm getting ahead of my. Let me take you back to where this story actually begins, because you need to understand who I was before that moment, and why I was standing in that jewelry store in a cardigan from Goodwill with a ring these women thought was worthless. My name, the name I'd been using for 3 years, was Anna Berg. Anna Bergman was 28 years old, taught kindergarten at a public school in Brooklyn, lived in a rent-stabilized studio apartment in Park Slope, and spent her weekends at farmers markets and used bookstores. Anna Bergman bought her clothes secondhand, took the subway packed her lunch in reused containers, and genuinely loved her job, working with 5-year-olds who didn't care if your shoes were from Payless or Prada. My actual name is Her Royal Highness Annika Elisabeth Bergström Laurent, Crown Princess of Valdavia, a small but extraordinarily wealthy Nordic nation whose sovereign wealth fund, built on centuries of strategic neutrality and careful investment, was currently valued at 160 billion. I was the only child of Queen Margareta and the late King Eric, which made me not just a princess, but the heir apparent to the Valdavian throne, a position I would assume on my 30th birthday in 18. I'd grown up in Silverholm Palace, a 16th-century fortress-turned-royal residence that housed 300 rooms and staff numbering the hundreds. I'd been educated by private tutors, presented at courts across Europe, photographed for every major publication that covered European royalty. By the time I was 25, I'd been proposed to 4 times by men from appropriate families, men whose interest in me was transparently connected to the crown I would one day and the fortune I would one day control. None of them had ever asked me None of them knew that I cried at children's books, or that I'd wanted to be a teacher since I was 12 years old, when my favorite tutor had told me that teaching was the most important work in the world because it shaped every generation. I'd gone to my mother 3 years ago with a proposal that had horrified my security and given the palace communications office stress and insomnia. I wanted to disappear, not forever, but long enough to know what it felt like to be chosen for myself rather than my title. I wanted to teach. I wanted to live in a small apartment and take public transportation and buy groceries and do laundry and all the ordinary things that my extraordinary life had never permitted. My mother, who'd married my father in a match arranged by their respective families and had spent 40 years performing a role rather than living, had looked at me across her desk in the private study and said, "Go, but you'll take security. Invisible security, but security, and you'll check in twice weekly. And Annika," she'd pause, "when you find what you're looking for, or when you discover it doesn't exist, you come home." Agreed? Agreed, I'd said. And so, Anna Bergman had been born. A cover identity so carefully constructed that it would take a forensic accountant weeks to trace the shell companies and trust structures that funded her modest life. A teaching certificate obtained through a legitimate program under a legitimate name. An apartment rented through standard channels. A life that was, by every visible metric, completely ordinary. I'd been Anna Bergman for 2 when I met James at a community garden in Brooklyn on a Sunday morning in May. He was kneeling in a vegetable bed, pulling weeds with methodical care, wearing jeans with actual dirt on them and a faded Columbia. He had light brown hair that fell into his eyes, and when he looked up and saw me standing there with my packet of herb seed, he'd smiled with genuine. "First time?" he'd asked. "That obvious? You're holding the seeds like they might explode," he'd said. "Which fair. Gardening can feel like that at first. Want help?" We'd spent 3 hours that morning planting my small plot, and he'd explained the difference between determinate and indeterminate tomato with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely cared about. He told me he worked as a pediatric resident at Brooklyn Methodist, that he'd grown up in Seattle, that his parents had been and had instilled in him an appreciation for things that grew slowly and required patience. When he asked if I wanted to get coffee, I'd said yes. We saw each other every weekend 2 months before it became more than gardening and coffee. He was careful in a way that felt respectful rather than distant. He asked about my about my about what I loved about working with children. He told me about the particular heartbreak medicine and the particular joy when a sick child. He never asked where I was from. When I told him I'd grown up in Europe, the States, he'd simply nodded and asked what I missed most about Europe. I'd said the forests. He'd taken me to Prospect Park the following weekend, and we'd walked through the wooded sections for hours. He proposed 14 months after we met, on a Tuesday evening in my tiny apartment, after we'd cooked dinner together and were washing dishes side by side. He turned off the water, dried his hands on a dish towel, and pulled a small box. The ring inside was an ant. He told me he'd found it at an estate sale in Connecticut, a Victorian-era piece with a cloudy rose-cut diamond in a tarnished gold setting. It had cost him $800, which represented careful saving from his residence salary. He told me he'd chosen it because it reminded him old, not trying to be anything other than. I'd cried because the ring was not because of what it was worth, but because of what it. James had chosen it believing I was Anna Berg, kindergarten, a woman with student loans and a small apartment and a modest salary. He loved me for the conversations and the life we were building and the person which was the person I am. Underneath there was just one problem. The ring I'd been wearing on my right hand since I was the ring I never took, the ring that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth and had been passed down 4 generations of Valdez. That ring, which I wore as Anna Bergman, claiming it was a family heirloom from a grandmother, was actually the Elizabeth Rose, a historically significant royal artifact featuring a rare pink diamond of 22 carats, set in a band that had been crafted 47 by the royal Duke of Bergstrom. James had never examined it closely enough to realize that the tarnished gold was actually platinum that had aged, that the cloudy stone was clouded by centuries rather than poor quality, that the ring he thought was a sentimental trinket was actually that belonged and was insured for an amount that would make most people physically. I'd planned to tell him. I'd been working up to it for months, constructing the conversation, imagining trying to find the right moment to explain that Anna Bergman was a costume and that underneath I was someone else. But I'd been too, because before I could have that conversation, I met Jay's family, and his family to the particular that only knew money and insecure. James's middle-class professionals, a software engineer and a high school English teacher who lived in Portland and were delighted their son had found someone who made him happy. They'd visited New York once, had taken me to dinner, had asked me about teaching with genuine. They were not the problem. The problem was James's cousin Victoria. Victoria Ashford Chen was 32 years old, had married into serious money at 24, and had spent the subsequent 8 years converting her husband's tech fortune into social capital with the dedication of someone conducting a military. She lived in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, wore exclusively designer clothes, carried bags that cost more than cars, and collected art and jewelry with the fervor of someone who believed objects. She'd inserted herself into our engagement with aggressive enthusiasm, insisting on hosting parties, insisting on being involved in wedding, insisting that we use her connections to various high-end vendors. James had been uncomfortable but hadn't known how. Victoria was family, and she framed her involvement as generosity rather than. The first incident happened an engagement Victoria hosted 3 months after James. The party was exactly what you'd expect, catered by a celebrity chef, bartenders mixing craft cocktails, a guest list full of people Victoria wanted to impress. I'd worn a simple dress from Everlane, comfortable and appropriate, but clearly not designer. Victoria had taken one look at me when I arrived and said, just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, "Oh, Anna, you look so comfortable. How refreshing that you don't feel the need to dress up for this." The word comfortable was delivered like an insult. Several of her friends had smirked into the champagne. James had squeezed my hand and whispered, "You look beautiful." Victoria's just being Victoria, which was the first of many times he would dismiss his cousin's behavior as a personality quirk rather than deliberate. The second incident happened at a dinner at an absurdly expensive restaurant in Tribeca, where Victoria had insisted on taking me to discuss wedding plans. She'd arrived in head-to-toe Chanel, had ordered the most expensive wine on the menu without asking if I wanted to share it, and had spent the first 20 minutes of dinner name-dropping designers and venues that cost more than my annual salary. Then she'd noticed my ring, the Elizabeth Rose, on my right hand, where I always wore. "What is that?" she'd asked, reaching across the table to grab my hand before I could pull it back. "It's a family ring," I'd said, "from my grandmother." She'd held my hand up to examining the clouded pink stone with an expression of poorly concealed disdain. It's very vintage. Is it real? It's real, I'd said. She'd said, which was not agreement, but skepticism. You should have it up. I know an excellent who could tell you what it's actually, or if it's worth anything at all. She'd smiled. Sometimes family pieces are more sentimental than valuable. You know, she'd released my hand and changed the subject, but the assessment had been made and filed. Victoria had decided my grandmother's ring was paste, and that decision confirmed everything he'd already concluded about my background. The third incident was the one that led directly to the jewelry, to the moment that would end all of this, with the precision of a door slamming. Victoria had insisted on taking me to Marchant & Rhodes, the most prestigious jewelry house in, to look at wedding bags and get ideas for the registry. Marchant & Rhodes was the kind of establishment where you needed an appointment just to browse, where the security was airport, where the clientele were billionaires and celebrities, and people for whom a $100,000 bracelet was an impulse. Victoria had an appointment. She was a known client, someone who spent enough money there to have a dedicated personal shopper and access to the private viewing room. We'd arrived together, Victoria in her Chanel and her Louboutin, me in my favorite cardigan and my comfortable flats, and I'd watched the staff's expressions shift as they assessed her. Victoria was greeted by name, offered champagne, ushered toward the private. I was tolerate. The saleswoman who approached me had smiled with professional politeness that didn't reach her eyes. Are you with Mrs. Ashford Chen? She'd asked. Yes, I'd said. Wonderful. Right this way. We'd spent an hour looking at wedding bands that cost more than semester's tuition, and Victoria had made performative noises about quality and craftsmanship, while the staff hadn't appropriate. Then, as we were preparing to leave, I'd made the mistake of asking the question that would change everything. Excuse me, I'd said to the senior saleswoman, a woman named Margaret, who'd been hovering near Victoria like a moon in. Would it be possible to have a ring clip? It's an old family piece and it's gotten quite tarnished. I'd held out my hand, showing the Elizabeth rose. Margaret had looked at Victoria first, some silent communication passing between them, and then she'd looked at my ring. She'd picked it up with 2 fingers, examined it for perhaps 3 seconds, and then she'd said, loudly enough that several other staff members and clients had turned to look. We don't service costume. Try Claire's at the mall. The room had gone very quiet. And then, a woman at the next counter, a client in her 50s, wearing enough diamonds to fund a small district, had laughed. Actually laughed. A high, cruel sound. Oh my God, she'd said. Is that even real metal? It looks like something from a gumball machine. Victoria had smiled. Not laughed, but smiled. A small, satisfied smile that told me this had been the plan. Or bring Anna to Marchant & Rhodes, expose her poverty, her fake family heirlooms, her complete unsuitability for the Ashford Chen social circle. Margaret had handed my ring back with an expression of distaste. I'm sorry, but we really do only work with authentic fine jewelry. I'm sure you understand. I'd stood there in that gleaming showroom, in my thrift store cardigan and my comfortable shoes, holding my great-great-grandmother's ring that these women had dismissed as worthless trash, and I'd made a decision. The experiment was over. I'd taken my phone from my bag, the special phone, the one I'd used exactly twice in 3 years, both times to check in with my security. I'd opened the contact labeled simply H, and I'd typed a message in Valdavian, the language of my country, the language that triggered immediate response protocol. The message said, Marchant & Rhodes, 5th Avenue, full retrieval, authorization, Silverholm 1, bring the vault. The response came in less than 10. Confirmed, 12 minutes, protocol act. I'd looked at Margaret, at Victoria, at the woman in diamonds who was still smirking with obvious. Thank you for your time, I'd said, my voice perfectly calm. I'll wait outside. I'd walked out of that showroom, through the security checkpoint, out onto 5th Avenue, where the afternoon sun was bright and the sidewalk was crowded with ordinary people going about their ordinary life. And I'd waited. Victoria had followed me out 30 seconds later, clearly uncomfortable with how the interaction had ended, but trying to maintain her. Anna, don't be upset. They're snobs. We can find somewhere else to clean your ring. It's fine, I'd said. Are you sure? You seem... I'm fine, I'd said. Actually, I'm perfect. She'd looked at me oddly. Okay, well, I should get back inside. I'm having them send some to my apartment for James's mother to see. You should go do that, I'd said. She'd hesitated, then gone back inside, leaving me alone on the... I checked my watch. 8 minutes. A text arrived on my regular phone. How's shopping with Victoria? Surviving? I typed back. Interest. Tell you about it. 6 minutes. I could see them now if I looked south down 5th Avenue. 3 vehicles moving in formation, black armored SUVs with diplomatic plates, and small Valdavian flags on the front court. They were still 4 blocks away, but they were coming with the unhurried certainty of people who knew the street would. 4 minutes. Behind me, inside Marchant & Rhodes, I could hear conversation and laughter. Victoria's voice, saying something about my cousin's fiancé, in a tone that suggested pity. Margaret's response, Something about managing expectation. 3 minutes. The SUVs were 2 blocks away now. People on the sidewalk were starting to notice, starting to point. Armored vehicles with diplomatic flags weren't exactly common in Midtown Manhattan. 2 minutes. The lead vehicle pulled up directly in front of Marchant and Rhodes and stopped. The second and third vehicles positioned themselves in a precise formation that blocked the entrance completely. Doors opened in perfect synchronization. 1 minute. 8 men emerged. Not security guards in suits. Royal guards in full ceremonial uniform, the formal dress uniform of the Valdavian Royal Protection Service. Dark blue wool coats with gold braiding, white gloves, ceremonial sword, the works. They moved with military precision, forming a corridor from the vehicles to where I stood. The captain, a man I'd known since childhood, approached me and bowed formally from the waist. "Your Royal Highness," he said in Valdavian, "we've brought what you requested." Behind him, 2 guards were opening the third vehicle's reinforced rear compartment. Inside was a case, a specially designed diplomatic transport made of brushed titanium with biometric locks and the Valdavian royal seal embossed on the lid. They carried it to the sidewalk and set it down with careful precision. Inside, Marchant and Rhodes, pressed against the windows, I could see Margaret, Victoria, the woman in diamond, other staff, all staring at the scene unfolding on the sidewalk with expressions ranging to dawning horror. I looked at the captain. "Open it," I said in English, loud enough to carry through the glass. He knelt, entered the biometric code, pressed his thumb to the scanner. The case opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, on a bed of midnight blue velvet, sat the Valdavian crown. It was a masterpiece of 19th century, a piece that had been commissioned in 1889 to celebrate the coronation of my great-great-great-grandmother. The centerpiece was a cushion-cut pink diamond of 53 carats, the famous Valdavian rose, surrounded by a double halo of white diamond totaling another 180. The band was platinum and white gold, set with additional pink and white diamonds in a scrolling pattern that caught light from every angle. The entire piece stood 7 inches, weighed 3 pounds, and was valued, at last official assessment, at $50 million. It matched my ring. The Elizabeth Rose and the Valdavian crown tiara had been designed as a set, crafted by the same jeweler, featuring stones from the same mine, meant to be worn together by the queens of Valdavia. I looked at the guards. "Inside," I said. "All of it. Now." They lifted the case, tiara and walked toward the entrance of Marchant and Rhodes with me, following behind them and the rest of the detail forming up around me. The security guard at the door started to protest, then saw the diplomatic flags on the vehicle and the armed guards in uniform and wisely stepped aside. We walked into that gleaming showroom, 8 royal guards carrying $50 million worth of crown jewels, and every single conversation. Margaret was standing exactly next to Victoria, both of them frozen with expressions that would have been funny if I'd had any capacity for humor left. The captain set the case on the nearest counter, directly in front of Margaret, with a solid sound that made several people jump. I walked to the counter and looked at Margaret with, "You said you don't service costume. I'd like to revise my request." My voice carried across the silent showroom with perfect clarity. "My name is Her Royal Highness Annika Elisabeth Bergström Laurent, Crown Princess of Valdavia. The ring you dismissed as a gumball machine trinket is the Elizabeth Rose, a royal artifact of the Valdavian crown dating to 1847. It features a 22-carat natural pink diamond and has been worn by every queen of Valdavia for 4 generations. It is, by conservative estimate, worth $12 million and is registered with Interpol as a protected cultural heritage." I held up my right hand, letting the tarnished band catch the light. "This tiara," gesturing to the case, "is the Valdavian crown tiara, created as a companion piece to the ring. 53-carat centerpiece stone, 180 additional carats in supporting diamond. Current valuation, 50. I looked at Margaret, whose face had gone the color of, "I'd like both pieces cleaned and inspected for damage. I assume Marchant and Rhodes is qualified to service authentic fine jewelry." The silence was absolute. Then, a man in an expensive suit appeared from somewhere in the back of the store, moving with the urgent speed of someone who'd just been informed of a catastrophic problem. He had the look of senior management, possibly ownership, and his face was doing complicated things as he processed. "Your Royal Highness," he said, and his voice owned, "I'm Robert Marchant, owner of this estate. I apologize profusely for any misunderstanding. We would be honored to service Margaret." He turned to the saleswoman, his expression hardening. "My office. Now, you're suspended pending a formal review." Margaret made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. "And Mrs. Ashford Chen," Robert, turning to Victoria, who looked like she might actually faint. "I believe your personal shopper relationship with this store is terminated, effective immediately. We don't associate with clients who facilitate." Victoria's mouth. She looked at her expression moving through shock, horror, and something that might have been the beginning of a standing. She'd brought me here humiliate. She'd orchestrated this entire scene to prove I didn't belong in her. She'd been catastrophically wrong about Anna, she started. Princess Anna, I correct my voice. And we're done, Vic. Completely. I turned to Robert. I'll need the pieces cleaned and inspected within the hour, and I'll need a private viewing room. There's a purchase. Of course, anything you need. Actually, I said, looking at Victoria there's one more thing. I pulled out my phone, the regular phone, and called James. He answered on the second. Hey, how's James? I said. I need you to come to Marchant and Rhodes on 5th Avenue, right now. There's something I need to tell you, and I need to tell you in person. Is everything okay? Everything is about to be very different. But yes, come now, please. I hung up and looked around at the guards standing at attention, at the crown tiara blazing, at Victoria, at Margaret, at the woman in diamond who was no longer smirking but looked like she wanted to disappear, and I waited for my fiancé so I could finally tell the truth about who he'd proposed in our time, because the Anna Bergman and the Annika Bergstrom Laurent part was about to be, whether I was ready for it. James arrived 17. I watched him through the window, walking up 5th Avenue in his scrubs, clearly having left the hospital, confusion, concern written across his face. He stopped when he saw the armored vehicle, the royal guards, the small crowd that had gathered at a respectful distance. He stopped again when he walked through the door and saw me standing in the center of the showroom, surrounded by 8 men in military dress uniform, next to a titanium case containing a tiara that could fund a small hospital for a decade. His eyes found mine. Anna, what's happening? Why are there guards? Why is Victoria crying in the corner? I looked at Victoria, who was indeed crying, mascara running down her face in dark tracks, being quietly escorted toward the door by a very firm security. The woman in diamonds had already left, practically running from the store. Margaret was nowhere to be seen, probably in Robert Marchant's office receiving the professional termination she so richly deserved. My name isn't Anna, I said. My voice was steady, but this was the moment where I found out if what we was real enough to survive. Not entirely. James walked closer, his eyes moving from me to the guards to the tiara and back to me. I don't understand. My full name is Annika Elizabeth Bergstrom Laurent. I'm the Crown Princess of Valdavia. My mother is Queen Margareta. I'm the heir to the Valdavian throne, and I've been living in New York under an assumed name for 3 years because I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for myself rather than my title. The words came out in a rush. 3 years of careful deception stripped away in 30 seconds. The ring on my right hand, the one your cousin and these saleswomen just mocked as costume jewelry, is a royal artifact worth $12 million. That tiara is worth 50, and I'm sorry I lied, but I needed to know if you... The silence stretched. James was staring at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language, which, in a sense, you're a princess, he said. Yes, an actual princess, with a throne and a palace, and he gestured vaguely at the guard. Yes, and you've been teaching kindergarten in Brooklyn. Yes. Why? It was the only question that mattered. I took a breath. Because every man who's ever pursued me has been pursuing a crown, not a person. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen for my laugh, or my thoughts, or the way I see the world, not for what I represent, or what I'm worth. Because you proposed to me believing I was a kindergarten student, and that meant everything. James looked at the ring on my right hand, really looked at it for the first time. That's real. That's real. And you let me give you an $800 ring. I loved that, and my voice cracked. I still love it. It's the only ring anyone has ever given me than calculum press or obligate. You gave it to... That's what he was processed. Around us, the Marchant and Rhodes staff were trying very hard to be invisible, while obviously listening every word. The guards stood at perfect attention, not reacting, simply present. Victoria brought you, said slow. Yes, because... Yes. And instead, she brought a princess and told them her royal art was fake. Essential. Yes. A strange sound. It took me a moment to recognize it. Slightly hysterical, but laughter nonetheless. That's the most Victoria thing he said. She spent 8 years climbing the social, and she just threw herself off it in the... She did. I agree. James looked at me, really looked at, his eyes searching my face. Are you still Anna? The woman who cried at the end of Charlotte's Web when we read it to your class? The woman who grows tomatoes and burns toast and falls asleep during movies? Yes, that's all real. That's all me. Annika and Anna aren't different. They're the same person with different context. And you love me. Actually love, not as part of some experiment. I love you so much it terrifies me, I said. I love you enough that I was planning to give up 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity to tell you the truth. I love you enough that I'm standing here risking everything because I need you to know who I actually... He took a step closer, then another. The guards shifted slightly but didn't intervene. James reached out and took my left hand, the hand wearing his estate sale ring, and looked at it. This ring still matters more to me than that one, he said, nodding to the Elizabeth, Because I chose this one. For Anna. For the woman I fell in love with at Garden. That woman is who I want to. I don't care if she. I care that. I started crying. Running down my face in a way I hadn't allowed my to cry in public since I was. The captain of the guard looked mildly alarmed, but stayed in position. However, James, and his voice had shifted slightly, taken on an edge. I do care that my cousin brought you here specifically to humiliate, and I care that these people treated you like garbage, and I'm extremely because I'm guessing you didn't call in the. I smiled through. You're correct. Good, he said. Because Victoria's been insufferable for 8 years, and I'd very much like to see her taken down several. I turned to Robert Marchant, who'd been hovering at a respectful distance, clearly torn between professional crisis management and morbid curiosity about what unfolding in his showroom. Mr. Marchant, I said, I'd like to make a purchase. But first, I'd like some information. Who owns this building? He blinked, confused by the question. The building? We lease the retail space, but the building itself is owned by a commercial real estate investment trust, Hartfield Property, I believe. And Marchant and Rhodes itself? Your company. Who owns it? It's privately held. My family has owned it, though we do have an investor who hold my. I see. I turned to who'd been standing at attention, but was clearly. Contact the sovereign. I want a full acquisition analysis on Marchant and Rhodes, completed by end of business to include ownership structure, investor information, and valuation. Also, I want information on Hartfield Property and the building we're currently standing in. Yes, Your Highness, he said, pulling out a phone and stepping up. Robert Marchant had gone very. Your Highness, I assure you, the behavior you experience today is not representative of our company's value. Margaret has been suspended. We will be conducting a full review of our customer service protocol. Please, there's no need for. I'm not interested in protocol, I said. I'm interested in outcome. Your senior saleswoman humiliated a client based on her appearance and the perceived value of her jewelry. She made those judgments loudly, publicly, and with the implicit backing of your establishment. That's not a training problem. That's a culture. I walked slowly around the showroom, looking at the cases of glittering jewelry, the carefully arranged displays, the entire apparatus of luxury retail designed to make some people feel included and others feel inferior. Marchant and Rhodes has been in business for how long? I asked. 147 years, Robert said quietly. And in those 147 years, you've built a reputation as the premier jewelry house in New York. People come here because a Marchant and Rhodes piece means something. It signals taste, wealth, status, correct? Yes, and that signal only works if you maintain exclusivity, if you make sure certain people feel welcome and certain people don't, if you train your staff to assess every person and make rapid judgment about whether they. Robert said no. We both knew. The problem, is that those assessments are based on appearance, on clothing and shoes and bags and the visible markers of wealth, which means you're not actually assessing wealth or status. You're assessing performance. You're assessing who's good at performing wealth. I stopped in front of him. I am worth, personally, approximately 14 billion. That's my personal fortune, separate from the Valdayan sovereign and separate from the crown asset. I could buy this company dividend, but I walk from goodwill. And I don't want I want your store. The room went very quick. Your Highness, Roberts. Captain Lindstrom had finished and returned to me. The Sovereign Investment Office reports that a full acquisition analysis can be completed by 1700 hours today. Preliminary assessment suggests Marchant and Rhodes is acquisition viable, though majority ownership would require negotiation with the minority stakeholder. Hartfield Properties is also acquisition. The building could be purchased outright within 30 days. I looked at Robert. Here's what's going to happen. The Valdavian Sovereign Investment Office is going to make an offer to purchase Marchant and Rhodes. It will be a fair offer based on proper valuation, but it will be a firm offer. You can accept it or decline it. If you decline it, we'll purchase Hartfield Property instead, buy this building, and decline to renew your lease when it expires in. I looked at Captain. 14 months, he supplied. 14 months, I repeat. At which point you'll be evicted, and this retail space will to a different, probably Cartier. They've been wanting a Fifth Avenue flagship location. Robert Marchant looked like he was having trouble breathing. That's business, I said. Your saleswoman made a business when she assessed me as unworthy of service. I'm making a business. The difference is, my assessment is based on accurate info. This is because of Margaret? Because of one employee's mistake? This is because your business model is built on making people feel and I don't particularly want that business model to continue operates current. I smiled, but it was not a consider this. I turned to the crowd of staff who'd gathered at the edges of the showroom, watching this unfold with expressions ranging from shock to fear. For everyone who works here, I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. Let me be clear. If Valdavia acquires this company, there will be a review. People who have treated clients with respect and dignity will keep their jobs. People who have used their positions to humiliate others will not. Start thinking now about which category you One of the younger saleswomen, a woman who'd been kind when I'd first entered with Victoria, raised a hesitant hand. Your Highness, I just want to say, I thought the way Margaret treated you was wrong. I told her so after several of us did. What's your name? I asked. Sarah. Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen, when the review happened, make sure they know you. Integrity should be rewarded. I looked around at. That applies to all of you. If you witnessed what happened and said nothing, that's a choice you own it. Captain Lindstrom's phone. He looked at it, then at me. Your Highness, the Queen is calling. She's seen the news coverage. Of course there was news coverage. 3 armored vehicles with diplomatic plates, 8 royal guards in full uniform, a tiara worth $50 million sitting open in the middle of a Fifth Avenue jewel. Someone had filmed it, someone had posted, and it had gone viral with my mother, who had sophisticated media monitoring systems tracking any mention of Valdavia or the royal family, would have been alerted immediately. I'll call her back, I said. Tell her I'm fine, and I'll explain everything shortly. She says it's urgent. Tell her I'm in the middle of acquiring a jewel, and I'll call her back in 20 minutes. Captain Lindstrom spoke quietly at his phone in Valdavia, then listened, then spoke again. His expression suggested my mother's response. She says 20 minutes, he reported, not 21. I checked my watch. Noted. I turned back to Robert. You have 72 hours to consider the offer. I'd recommend you. The alternative significant. And if what happens to March? It continues on. Under new ownership, with new policy, but it can. Your family legacy doesn't end. It just evolves. I'd actually recommend you stay on as consultant. You know this bit. You know the clients. You just need to understand that the business model needs to change. He nodded slowly. He wasn't happy, but he was smart enough to see that this was the best possible, given what just happened. Now, I said, before I leave, I do actually want to make 2 per. I walked to one of the cases and pointed to a simple band, platinum with a small channel of diamond, a wedding band, elegant and understated. That one, in my size. Sarah Chen moved to retrieve it immediately, clearly eager to be helpful. And for James, I looked at who'd been watching all of this with expressions somewhere between awe and disbelief. Something simple, no diamond, just a good solid band. Platinum, his choice. Platinum, James said faintly. To match yours. Sarah brought both rings, sized them, packed them in simple boxes. She handed them to me with a small, genuine smile. It's an honor, Your Highness. Thank you, Sarah. I turned to send the bill to the Valdavian embassy. They'll process through the usual. Of course, Your Highness. He stopped, started again. I truly am sorry for. If I could undo it, I would. You can't I said. But you can learn from it. That's all any of us can. I looked at the tiara, still sitting open in its case on the counter, throwing rainbow light across every surface. Captain, please have the crown pieces cleaned and inspected, then return to the vault. I won't be needing. Yes, I took James's hand. Come on, we're leaving. Where are we going? Anywhere that isn't. I need to call my mother in, and I'd prefer to do it somewhere private. We walked out of Marchanton Roads, through the corridor of guards, past the armored vehicle, onto Fifth Avenue, where a crowd of approximately 200 people had gathered to watch. Phones were out everywhere. I could hear the murmurs, the question, the speculation. The guards formed up around us, creating a protective bubble, and we walked to the second vehicle. The captain opened the door, handed me inside, and James followed. The door closed with a solid thunk, cutting off the noise and the crowd, and the entire surreal scene. Inside the armored vehicle, it was quiet and dim, and surprisingly calm. James sat beside me, still holding my hand, and for a moment, that was the most insane thing, he said. I'm sorry you had to find out this. I was planning to. I'd been working up. I believe you. He squeezed my hand. Annika, whoever you are, I believe you. I'm both. I need you to understand. I'm not putting on a costume each kindergarten. That's the princess part is also, but it's not the. I get it. I think it's going to take to fully. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother in Valdavia. 17. I called her. She answered before the first ring. Annika, she said, in the tone of a mother who is experiencing every emotion simultaneously. Please tell me you haven't started an international incident by purchasing an American jewelry company in retaliation. It wasn't it was actual, and I haven't purchased. I've just initiated. Annika, mother, they called the Elizabeth Rose a piece from a gumball. They refused to service it. They told me to try Claire's at the silence on the other end of the line was profound and dangerous. When my mother spoke again, her voice had changed. It was the voice she in Parliament when she was about to destroy someone's argument they insulted a designated royal art, a piece that has been worn by 4 queens of Valdavia. Yes, and you responded by calling in the royal guard and delivering the crown tiara to a retail establishment. Yes, and now you're buying the company. It seemed appropriate. Then unexpectedly, my mother, actually, a sound I heard maybe twice a year. Your grandmother would, she said. She always said the Elizabeth Rose would cause trouble. She just thought it would be through theft, not through someone being stupid enough to insult it to the crown prince's face. So you're not angry? Oh, I'm furious, but not at you. Give me the names of everyone involved. I'll have the diplomatic corps send formal letter. Make them already handled, I said. Margaret's been suspended. Victoria's been banned from the store. And the acquisition will send a very clear message about the consequences of disrespecting Valdale property. Good. My mother's voice softened. Are you all right? Actually all right? I'm fine. Better than fine, I told James. How did he take it? I looked at James, who was listening to my half of the conversation with a slightly overwhelmed expression. He's still processing, but he's here. He came when I called and he's still here. Then he's a key, my mother said. Bring him home. I want to meet the man who proposed to my daughter with an $800 ring. How do you know about the ring? Annika, I'm your mother, and I'm the Queen of Valdavia. I know everything. Bring him home. Formal visit. Let's see if he can handle palace. You commit to anything permanent. That's fair. And Annika, well done today. Truly, you handled that with grace and appropriate. That's the balance every monarch needs. I'm proud of you. My eyes. Thank you. Now go handle your jewelry and then get some rest. You're all over international news, and you need to make a statement. I'll have communication. Love you. Love you too. I hung up and looked at. So, want to meet my mother? She's inviting you to Valdavia. Formal state visit, diplomatic protocols, formal dinners, the whole thing. Will there be more tiara? He asked. So many tiara. Then yes, absolutely. But first, can we go back to your apartment? Our apartment? I need to sit somewhere normal and process the fact that my kindergarten fiancée is a literal princess who just bought a jewelry company because they were rude to her. I smiled. That's fair. The vehicle pulled into traffic, the other two SUVs falling into formation. Through the tinted windows, I could see New York sliding past, the ordinary city full of ordinary people, none of them knowing that the woman in the middle vehicle was having possibly the strangest day of her. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Sarah Chen, from Marchant and Rhodes. I just wanted to say thank you for what you said about integrity, and I'm sorry about what it was wrong. I typed back, thank you for speaking up. That took courage. Another buzz. This one from Victoria. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Please. I stared at that. Then I typed, you didn't know because you never are. You assumed. And you built an entire afternoon around humiliating me based on those assumptions. But I hope you. I blocked her number. James, was that her? Yes. What did you say? That I don't. She brought me to that store specifically to make me feel small. She wanted to prove I didn't belong in her. She got what she deserved. You're kind of terrifying, James. I mean that as a compliment. Good, I said. Because the woman you fell in love with, she's just also a princess who doesn't tolerate people treating her like garbage. I'm extremely okay, James said. The vehicle pulled up outside my building in Park Slope. The guards confirmed the building was secure, checked the perimeter, and finally allowed us to exit. We walked into my building, up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken, and into my tiny studio apartment with its radiator and its view of another building's brick wall. James sat on my second-hand couch, still in his scrubs, and I sat beside him with my mug of tea and my engagement ring from an estate sale and my other ring that was worth $12 million, and we were quiet. So what happens now? James asked finally. Now we figure it out, I said. I can't be Anna Bergman anymore. That part is over, but I can still teach if I want to. I can still live in New York, at least part of the. We can still have the life we were building. It just has to include the princess part and the tiara part. Occasionally, yes, there will be tiaras. Can I watch you wear a tiara? That can be arranged. Then I'm in, he said. Completely. Anna, Annika, princess, kindergarten, all of it. I'm in. I kissed him, long and thoroughly, there in my tiny apartment, with the broken elevator and the radiator that clanged. And I felt like maybe, possibly, I'd actually found what I'd been looking for when I gave up my tiara 3 years and came to New York to. True power, I'd learned, wasn't about the size of, or the weight of your crown, or the number of guards who stood at attention. True power was knowing exactly who you were and refusing to accept anyone's attempt to make you smaller. It was sitting in a jewelry store and letting someone call your priceless artifact trash, and then calmly, methodically, destroying their entire world while never once raising. It was teaching 5-year-olds to read and buying jewelry company and wearing thrift store cardigans and $50 million tiaras with equal comfort because all of it was real and all of it was you. And it was finding someone who could see all those pieces and love every single. 3 weeks later, the Valdavian Sovereign Investment Office completed the acquisition of Marchant. Robert Marchant accepted the offer after 71 hours of. The company continued operating under new management, with new policies that explicitly forbade discrimination based on appearance and mandated regular training on implicit bias and customer respect. Margaret was terminated. 3 other employees who'd participated in or enabled her behavior were also let go. Sarah Chen was promoted to senior sales associate and given a substantial raise. Victoria's husband filed for divorce 2 months later, citing irreconcilable difference. She lost the penthouse, and I kept part-time now, 3 days a week, because the rest of my time was consumed with learning to actually crown prince rather than carrying the title. But I kept teaching because those 5-year-olds didn't care about or wealth or who my mother. They cared that I read with funny voices and brought in caterpillars for the science and gave the best hugs when they fell down. That was real power, maybe the realest. What did you think of this absolutely devastating story? Did those snobby saleswomen get exactly what they deserved when the crown princess they'd mocked as poor bought their entire company? Did you feel the satisfaction when the guards marched in carrying $50 million in crown jewels and every single person who'd laughed realized exactly how wrong they were? If you loved watching entitled, judgmental people learn that you should never assume someone's worth based on their cardigan, then smash that like button. Share this with everyone who's ever been underestimated by someone who confused designer labels with actual class. And subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of hidden, perfect karma, and the moment when people who think they have meet someone who actually does. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have said to Margaret when she got a $12 million royal artifact, a gumball. Because some mistakes don't just cost you your job, they cost you everything.